So one afternoon, after I got home from work a year or so ago, for those of you who don't know, I am a French teacher over in Caribou. And when 3 p.m. hits every day, bye. So after a school day got done, I got back to my house and I sat down on my couch and I began my afternoon ritual, which involves coming in, saying hi to the animals, go to the couch, plop on said couch, turn on the TV, and make sure that everything I need is within reach. Maybe you can relate to that. So once everything is set, I've got my remotes, my snacks, my water, my what have you. Usually there's a pet here looking at me as well. I go ahead and do what most people find themselves doing: pull out my phone and start the scroll. So even though I spend most of my working days telling my students, put your phone away, stop putting that on the desk. No, I can still see you if you're texting underneath the desk. You're not crafty. I'll be the first to admit, when I get a chance, that phone's out. And as I was sitting there one day, mindlessly scrolling, I came across a story. And normally when you come across these stories on Facebook or whatever social media platform you're on, they don't always stick with you. They're kind of, we used to get those chain emails back in the day, dime a dozen, yeah, whatever. This story, however, like I said, it stuck with me. And before I get into the actual story, I'll preface it by saying, before any of this spoke to me, before any of this stirred in my heart, the header said, open your eyes, open your heart. If you can't do that, read this story and it'll help. Now, if you spend more than 30 seconds with me, you'll learn that my sense of humor is incredibly sarcastic. I have what my students like to call the clap back. I've perfected it to an art form. So when I read this and I was like, all right, really? Facebook story? You're gonna rock my world, are you? So I reeled it in. I decided, no, I'm not gonna crack a joke. It happened to be shared by a faith group that I follow. So I thought, okay, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And so I got reading. And the story that I'm about to share with you, it's made its rounds on social media a few times. If you're not a social media person, the story has actually been floating around since the 1970s, so you may very well know it. I promise that's not a dig about age. I have to throw that out there. So I'm going to do my best to paraphrase this. Once upon a time, as all good stories begin, there was a megachurch in a large city in North America. You know the type. Large arena-style building with matching seating and attendance numbers, screens, worship bands playing the latest CCM radio hits, and so on and so forth. The pastor, who is pretty much almost guaranteed to be male, walks on stage in the latest trendy garb and begins the show. Now, this particular megachurch was coming up on a time of transition. Their senior pastor was retiring after decades of serving his faith community. Because of that, a committee had been formed, candidates were vetted, and a new pastor had been selected to lead the congregation. A few Sundays before the new pastor was due to take over, however, he decided he wanted to get a feel for the congregation that he would soon be serving. He also was fully aware of the fact that if he were to show up unannounced in his best pastoral garb, everyone would be on their best behavior. He'd see what they wanted him to see. So he devised a plan. He cleared it with the outgoing pastor first so he wouldn't catch him off guard. The guy said, all right, and he got to planning. The following Sunday, new pastor, from here on out, I'll refer to him as NG, new guy. He approaches his new church in disguise. Rather than his normal uniform of Dockers brand khakis and a bland pastel polo that his wife picked out for him as he rolled his eyes, NG was wearing ragged, ripped jeans, a ripped and stained flannel shirt, and sneakers with worn out soles. He'd let his normally impeccably styled hair go lank and unwashed for several days in preparation. Based on this description, he appeared to be someone who was, at that present time, experiencing homelessness. This provided a very sharp contrast to the well-dressed congregants. Surely, NG thought to himself, this literal gilded beacon of Christ's kingdom would be able and up to the task, the basic Christian task of welcoming a stranger in need. As he entered into the sanctuary, just in another anonymous face in the masses, no one met his gaze. When the smiling woman at the back handing out bulletins saw him coming, she quickly busied herself with a new young couple. Continuing on, NG decided to take his seat. Rather than sitting in the back, he decided to choose a seat smack dab in the middle of the sanctuary. As expected, this was someone else's unofficial seat, and he had taken it. I heard a laugh. We all know, we all have that unofficial seat. I grew up Baptist. Unofficial seats are so unofficial, they've come full circle to be official. Don't sit somewhere that's not yours. Just a word of advice. So, as expected, this was someone else's seat. And all of a sudden, as he was looking down, he saw 2 feet next to him. He looked up at the man whose seat he'd taken, and he was met with a glare that quickly masked itself as indifference before the man walked away. Not a single word was uttered. In the remaining minutes before the service began, passerby furtively passed and ignored the seated newcomer. Not one single person stopped to even say hello. No one. The worship team started up their opening number as everyone took their spots. As the opening guitar chords rang out, people jumped to their feet and began raising their hands. Eyes closed, voices rang out to God Most High. As people were immersing themselves in this worship experience, NG noticed the folks around him slowly migrating away. After the worship team had finished their first set, the senior pastor took to his sleek, iPad-capable podium and began the weekly announcements. After some housekeeping, the pastor cleared his throat and announced, "As many of you know, my last Sunday with you all is coming soon. After prayerful consideration, the hiring committee has made their selection. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce him to you all today." See where this is going? Suddenly, the grubby man that everyone had been so careful to avoid before the service rose to his feet and approached the stage. He looked out at several hundred people stunned into silence. Not 5 minutes ago, these individuals were the ones closing their eyes and lifting their hands in prayer to heaven. NG proceeded to give the sermon that Sunday. Ironically, he'd planned on speaking on Christian compassion. He didn't plan on the tone of it changing based on his experience. The thing is, even though the tone had to change, he didn't have to have a fire and brimstone sermon designed to shame people on hand. Not that that was really his style anyway. Instead, the sermon on compassion and grace talked about how it is a two-way street for all of God's children. He spoke of the need for God's grace to transform all facets of our being, even those bits we don't like in ourselves or in others, especially in others. To say that those listening had a lot of thinking and reflecting to do was a bit of an understatement. So much like the parable in today's gospel reading, the veracity of this social media tale isn't really what's important. Rather, it's vital to see and understand here, as well as in the parable, that we are loved by a God of grace that is indiscriminate with said grace. So indiscriminate with grace, in fact, that it may cause some of us, as God's children, to do a double take or even recoil at those that grace is shown to. When we begin to accept the reality that grace is for everyone, it almost becomes a four-letter word when we realize everyone. In the story, the folks who had worked so hard to ignore the individual who then turned and put on a great show of worshipful adoration, their outward piety manipulated and in turn clashing with that inward human nature. These folks, they share a parallel with the Pharisee and the tax collector. Before I go any further, though, I will do a little clarification on this passage. Throughout the centuries, this passage has often been misinterpreted and used as a way to perpetuate anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes. If you're unaware of what anti-Semitic means, anti-Jewish. This has been a passage that often gets misinterpreted as a way, like I said, to bludgeon others and as a way to make the individual feel superior. This also is a way to attack the temple of Jerusalem. I forgot to mention that little bit. So, in this interpretation, in this line of thinking, the Pharisee, being the pinnacle of religious devotion, clearly cares about religious ritual purity more than the relationship that the individual has with God. That obviously being the parallel shown with the tax collector. The institution of the Temple of Jerusalem, with all its laws and rituals, are so important to this Pharisee in this interpretation that it leaves no space for God. At its worst, this interpretation has been used to help dehumanize and attack entire people groups, like I said. And at best, it breeds a spirit of elitism, snobby attitude in some modern Christian Bible interpretations. It takes 30 seconds to look through human history and see some of the ways that this type of passage has been used by numerous theologians and politicians to further their own ends. This is even the way that my seminary that I went to taught us how to interpret this text. After all, it reinforces the worldview of a certain faith tradition, and it makes them feel superior. It's in the Bible, after all, right? So even though the anti-Semitism wasn't explicit, it was clearly meant to imply that ritual and the temple did not hold a candle to the beating heart of the personal relationship that one has with the Almighty. Think of it like a first century American evangelical lens applied to a first century Jewish parable, if you will. The reality of all of this, the reality of this misinterpretation, is that it completely ignores what Jesus was originally trying to convey to those first century listeners. In fact, it cheapens Jesus's words into another way of saying, thank God we are better than those people who worship ever so slightly different from us. It reinforces the spiritual elitist delusion that Jesus was actually speaking against here. It becomes neat and easy for those who are looking to feel good about themselves and the choices that they, the individual, have made. It completely ignores what is going on here and what Jesus originally wanted to teach, because I honestly think this lesson and its truth is such a struggle for humanity to grapple with and accept, even to this day. Actually, it's downright offensive to our sensibilities sometimes. As I was writing this, all I could think of was this little indignant version of me in my head saying, wait a minute, you mean to tell me that this person who literally tumbled out of the figurative basket of deplorables is fully loved and accepted by God alongside myself, who goes to church, tithes, prays, supports ministry? What is the point? This is why Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber says that Jesus' teachings should really come with a warning label. Caution, contents may actually cause extreme discomfort if actually ingested. This is not a light touch parable meant to stoke the individual's ego. It's meant to get under your skin and challenge the way you see the world and the way that you see yourself. It's meant to challenge the way Little side note, what you've just witnessed is something that happens in my classroom. Often I'll be mid-sentence and it just goes, and I just kind of stand there and go and look at a student and say, what was I talking about? It's all good, I promise. It's common, it happens. So anyway, as I was saying before the big wipe happened and it was just blue screen of death behind my eyes, this parable is meant to challenge the way we see others as the way we see and the way we see ourselves. It's a challenge for us because that challenges us to see ourselves the way that God sees us. That's even harder than seeing others the way God sees us sometimes. To the first century Jewish listener, the contrast would not have been between the snobby Pharisee and a daring tax collector that we've interpreted all these years out of this. In first century Judea, the Pharisees were a group of Jews who believed that firm observance of the Torah was the most efficacious lifestyle to be closer to God. Also at this point in history, their influence was much more rural rather than cosmopolitan. That is to say, they didn't really hold an influential position in society or in the temple at this point. And as a matter of fact, the first century Jewish listener would probably had positive thoughts about this Pharisee because of his prayer, because of his devotion, because of his tithing. Outwardly, all of the right things are there. And on the other hand, we have the tax collector, where many have interpreted his profession as the cause of ritual uncleanliness and ostracization. He's actually standing far away because his work as a tax collector deems him an agent of the occupying force, the Roman Empire. It's a work hazard. Impurity and ostracization aren't even mentioned. Professor Amy Jill Levine says in her work, Short Stories by Jesus, several of you did the book group with Pastor Tim a while ago. She says that neither Pharisee nor tax collector behaves in the manner that a first century Jewish audience would expect. Listeners would be surprised that a Pharisee would be dismissive of others in the community. They would be surprised that a tax collector can be repentant. She goes on to further explain that the parable does not critique the temple. To the contrary, the temple is the place that welcomes both the Pharisee and the tax collector, and it is the place where both find justification. How they both find justification is the challenge and the surprise of the parable. This is what it means in the sermon title, The Offense of Grace, where modern interpretations of this parable reinforce the us versus them mentality that pits tradition unnecessarily against an unbridled seeking heart. When you do that, it's easily tied up. Everything fits. Neither the Pharisee nor the tax collector is an inch closer to God than the other, for both are earnest in their expressions of faith to a God who is by very nature love. As a result of this, both ends of the justification spectrum are called beloved. The Pharisees' fasting, praying, and tithings are blessings to the community at large, right? These are earnest, outward expressions of an inward faith in God. The tax collector, they're justified by their faith. They're justified by the heart that calls out and seeks to know God. This contrast in justifications is the punch of the parable. Grace is grace whether we like it or not. Dr. Levine also says they knew that the God of Israel was generous. In their view, there is enough grace for Pharisee and tax collector alike. They knew the tax collector could be justified. The problem was they, the first century Jewish listeners, would not have really liked that idea. That discomfort was meant to sit with the listener. You see, when it all comes down to it, we don't actually know if Jesus intended for the Pharisee to sound genuine in his faith or to sound self-righteous. But his actions were beneficial. The original Greek wording can be translated in a multitude of ways here, which leads to a multitude of translations and interpretations. Throughout the years, many have translated as The way I read it a little bit earlier, this person went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. But when you look at the original text, the Greek preposition para can be translated in so many ways that when it's put into modern English, it could also be translated, person went down to his home justified alongside the Pharisee. There's some translations that even say the Pharisee was the justified one, not the tax collector. All of this is to say, where some are seeing failure to agree, if we're to lean into this universal grace that is for everyone, maybe instead look for the Holy Spirit dancing through human debate, sprinkling that grace like rain. Now, in order to be completely fair to both sides of the parable, while the tax collector outwardly appears contrite, we don't fully know their motivations either. Was he genuine? Or was he trying to avoid the negativity his job brought him? See, that's the thing about these parables. There's never really one way to completely land. The one constant that runs through all of them is that God is actively seeking to turn our systems and practices of exclusion into full inclusion that only can be provided through the grace of God. At the end of the parable, God calls them justified. After centuries of rabbinic and pastoral debate, God still calls them justified. God calls them God's own. In the big picture, we see a small picture. Something like grace that is so complex in thought that theologians have, in some cases, battled over the definition of grace and who gets it and who receives it. Yet at the end of this parable, both extremes receive grace and are justified. Complex, yet simple. That's what makes it so offensive to human sensibility when it's presented to us this way by Jesus. There's no easy explanation other than it is the grace of God that lives and moves amongst us. It lives and moves in spite of us. The faithful adherent stands justified alongside an agent of the oppressor. To be honest, the first time I had it put in that context, I audibly went, oof, like, that's hard. And it's especially hard when we as a species have always actively sought to include or deny in order to make ourselves feel better. What would that look like today in 2022 when we don't want to show grace to those who aren't gracious to us? When it would be easier to just look away? When we see those who would support policies that harm us or our loved ones, what do we do? How do we do this? We start by remembering that the grace we are supposed to show others is the same grace and mercy that has been bestowed upon us by God. Another parable comes to mind. I'm thinking of a ticked off son who complains that his runaway prodigal brother is treated like a king for running away. Has he not, he the elder brother, has he not always done what was asked of him and stayed home to help their father? Didn't he do everything right? One can almost hear a father sighing in a knowing manner before saying, "But my child, everything I have is already yours." When we lose sight of that which is already ours and slip into self-righteous justification patterns, whether it's, thank goodness I vote this way, thank goodness I'm not like those hypocritical Christians. Spoiler alert, when you say those things and believe those things, you are. Just in case you hadn't picked that one up yet. We become those individuals that Jesus originally was telling the parable for. Right at the beginning of the passage, it says, and I quote because I don't trust myself to remember it, Jesus told this parable to certain people who had convinced themselves that they were righteous and who looked on everyone else with disgust. It's not whether or not the Pharisee was self-righteous and in his religiosity. It's what's in the heart. When we revert to human systems, we're always bound to fail. This parable still carries such a relevance and weight today because I think we're still trying to grapple with how offensively deep and strong God's grace is. So, to that I say, learn to accept offense when grace is the one that's crashing through your life and making a mess of things. It is in that reckless acceptance, even when we do not understand why, it's in there that God meets us. It is in that space that we connect in love and can then bring the kingdom and be the kingdom this world needs the church to be. Whatever your path, stay humble as you lean into grace. Whether you've been a churchgoer from this age right up until now, whether you're here for the first time today wondering what this is all about, lean into the grace. May its offense soften to joy in your walk of faith. Amen.